My name is Emily, and I am 28 years old, a nursing student just 3 months away from graduation. I had driven 6 hours to return home for Christmas, my car packed full of carefully wrapped gifts. However, when I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. There were no decorations, no laughter, no familiar chaos, just Grandma Helen sitting in the kitchen eating microwave turkey. A hastily scribbled note was stuck to the refrigerator. Spent your $10,000 student loan on a family vacation. We'll be back in 4 days. Take care of Grandma. Love you. Grandma looked at me with a calm expression and said, "We will fix this." I nodded silently. 4 days later, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened. I grew up in a middle-class family in a small town in Missouri. My father, Tom, worked in sales, and his income was unpredictable. Some months we lived comfortably, but others we barely made it by. My mother, Sarah, was a part-time receptionist, often spending more than she earned. My brother Chris was 2 years older than me, and my sister Lily was 3 years younger. Grandma Helen had moved in with us after Grandpa passed when I was 10, and she had always been the steady presence in our otherwise chaotic home. While my parents struggled with financial instability, Grandma maintained a calm and practical approach to life. She taught me to budget, save, and plan for the future lessons that my parents never seemed to learn. Our bond was special. On nights when Mom and Dad argued about money, I would slip into Grandma's room and she would tell me stories about her youth or help me with my homework. "You have a good head on your shoulders, Emily. You are going to break this cycle," she would say. I tried. After high school, I was accepted into nursing school in Chicago. I worked multiple jobs, waiting tables in the mornings, working at the library in the afternoons, and taking weekend shifts at a nursing home. Every penny counted as I balanced tuition, rent, textbooks, and the basic necessities. The $10,000 student loan I had taken was for my final semester, covering clinical rotations and certification exams. I had avoided debt for nearly 4 years, but these last requirements were impossible to fund from my part-time jobs alone. The loan was the final hurdle before I could graduate and become a registered nurse with a steady income. However, my family's history of financial irresponsibility sometimes spilled over into my life, adding extra strain. My father once borrowed my car, a used Honda, I had saved for over 2 years, only to return it with a broken transmission that he could not afford to repair. Mom frequently had emergencies that required loans, but she rarely paid them back. Chris borrowed money for textbooks one semester and paid it back 3 months late after I had to use my credit card. Lily once used my credit card for what she claimed was an emergency, only for me to find out later it was for concert tickets. Each time I forgave them because they were family, and despite their flaws, I loved them. Grandma would always remind me, "Love does not mean being a doormat, Emily." But I kept making excuses for them. Christmas was always special to me. Even during the leanest years, my parents made an effort to create magical memories. The house would be transformed with lights and decorations, the smell of cookies filling the air. And for a few days, the financial stress seemed to fade away. As an adult, I continued this tradition, budgeting carefully throughout the year to buy thoughtful gifts for everyone. This year, I had gone the extra mile. For my mom, I found an antique brooch that resembled one her grandmother had worn. For Dad, I found a rare first edition of his favorite Western novel. Chris would receive high-end headphones for his music career, and Lily a leather portfolio for her art school projects. For Grandma Helen, I splurged on a cashmere sweater and digitized all our family photos onto a digital frame. I had spent months planning and budgeting for the perfect holiday, but as I drove south toward my hometown, I imagined a familiar scene awaiting me. Mom would be in the kitchen, Dad would be watching football, and Grandma would be sitting in her recliner knitting. The house would smell like pine, and the Christmas tree would be twinkling. But when I finally arrived, I had no idea that the home I had imagined would no longer be there. Growing up in Springfield, Missouri, life was always unpredictable. My family was caught in the grip of financial chaos, a cycle that never seemed to end. Some months we had more than enough, but others we were scraping by, not even sure how we were going to make rent. My father, Tom, was a salesman, a profession that had its ups and downs. On good months, he'd bring in a hefty paycheck and life would feel easy. But when sales were slow, our world would crumble, and there was never a warning about how bad it could get. Mom Sarah worked part-time as a receptionist at a local dentist's office. She didn't make much, but she was often too willing to spend more than she earned. She was always looking for the next thing that would make her happy, new clothes gadgets or a family vacation to escape the stress. But those trips were never as carefree as she imagined. We never had the luxury of planning ahead, and it was always about immediate gratification. Meanwhile, the bills piled up, and my dad's commissions couldn't keep up with her habits. It wasn't just the adults in my family who caused problems. My older brother, Chris, had always been the rebellious one, borrowing money whenever it suited him and never paying it back on time. He was always chasing his dream of becoming a music producer, but he never seemed to take the financial responsibility seriously. He spent more money on equipment than he ever earned, and it left the rest of us trying to patch up the financial holes he created. Lily. My younger sister was no different. She was the artist of the family, and I always admired her creativity, but she had a tendency to believe that the world would bend to her whims. She didn't understand the value of money, and often used my credit card without asking, claiming it was for emergencies. When I found out she had bought concert tickets instead, I was furious. It felt like no one in my family understood how hard I worked to keep things together, how every dollar counted. But the worst part of it all was my parents' inability to manage their finances. They would argue constantly about money, and I would be caught in the middle trying to mediate, even though I was just a teenager. My parents would argue, and I would listen feeling helpless. There were times when my father, in a fit of frustration, would lash out, blaming everything on the economy, or his job, or my mother, and Mom in turn would accuse him of not being able to provide for the family. Meanwhile, I sat there, the observer, trying to make sense of it all. The one constant in all of this was Grandma Helen. She was a beacon of stability in our otherwise chaotic home. Grandma had lived through the Great Depression and knew how to manage money, something my parents never learned. She had always been frugal, and that frugality was a trait she passed down to me. I would often sit with her listening to her stories from when she was young. She would talk about the hardships she had faced and how important it was to save for a rainy day. Grandma was never a burden on us, even when things got tight. She contributed in whatever way she could, but she always made sure to maintain her independence. She would sew, cook, and help around the house without ever asking for anything in return. And when I needed someone to talk to, she was always there. I would retreat to her room whenever I needed an escape away from the constant bickering of my parents. She would comfort me, tell me stories of her childhood, and remind me that I was smarter than the financial mess my parents had created. As I grew older, I began to realize that my family's financial habits were deeply ingrained. My parents would ask for loans, promising to pay them back, but they never did. I remember when I bought my first car, a used Honda Civic. I had worked for 2 years, saving every penny I could. It was an important achievement for me, and I was so proud of it. But one weekend, my dad borrowed the car to run errands, and when he returned it, the transmission was damaged. I was devastated. He promised to fix it, but he never did. I had to pay out of my own pocket to repair it. I had learned to be cautious about lending money to my parents, but it didn't stop them from asking. One semester, when I needed money to buy textbooks, my mom suggested I use my credit card to cover the cost. When I did, she promised to pay it back, but of course she never did. And there was always the same excuse. "We've been through a tough time, Emily. Please understand." So I forgave her. I kept telling myself that they were family and they needed my help, but the truth was, I had become their financial safety net, and I didn't know how to say no. At some point, I realized that the only reason my family wasn't completely falling apart financially was because of me. I was working multiple jobs while in school, trying to make sure I didn't fall into the same traps. It wasn't easy. I had to be disciplined about how I spent my money, and I couldn't afford luxuries. But I kept going because I knew that the future was worth it. I had dreams of becoming a nurse, of making something of myself, and not letting my family's mistakes dictate my future. But no matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I worked, the weight of my family's expectations never seemed to lift. They would always ask for more. They would promise to pay me back, but the cycle never ended. It seemed that every time I made progress, they would find a way to drag me back into their financial mess. It wasn't just the money, it was the emotional toll too. I would get angry, frustrated, and exhausted, but I would never say anything. I would just keep helping, because that's what family did right. That's when Grandma Helen's words started to really sink in. She would often say, "Love does not mean being a doormat, Emily. You can't let them take advantage of your kindness." But I never really understood what she meant. How could I turn my back on my family when they needed me so much? How could I refuse them? But deep down, I started to realize that I was enabling their behavior, and it was only making things worse. I was caught between two worlds. On one side, I had my family who I loved deeply, and on the other I had my own dreams, my own future, and my own sense of self-worth. I began to feel trapped, suffocated by the expectations of being the responsible one, the one who always bailed everyone out. It was clear that my family had never learned the value of responsibility, and I had been their fallback for so long that I had stopped thinking about my own needs. When I was accepted into nursing school, I was thrilled, but there was always that looming worry. Would I be able to afford it? Could I keep up with the work and still support my family financially? I worked harder than ever to make ends meet. I didn't take any breaks. I rarely saw my friends, but I kept pushing forward because I knew that this was my chance to break free from the cycle. This was my chance to change my life. As I prepared for my final semester, I took out the student loan I had been avoiding for years. The $10,000 would cover my clinical rotations and certification exams. It was the last hurdle before I could officially graduate and start working as a nurse. But as I prepared to go home for Christmas, I had no idea that everything would change in a matter of days. I was about to face the betrayal that would force me to finally take a stand and demand that my family face the consequences of their actions. In this part of the story, Emily begins to reflect deeply on the financial struggles that have shaped her life and the way her family has taken advantage of her kindness and responsibility. Her love for her family is clear, but so is the growing realization that enabling them has only perpetuated their irresponsible behavior. It's clear that the lessons learned from Grandma Helen's wisdom will play a significant role in what happens next. The days after I returned from Christmas were a whirlwind of emotions, and my mind constantly raced with a mix of anger, disbelief, and panic. The note left by my parents about spending my $10,000 student loan on a family cruise had shaken me to my core. It wasn't just the fact that they had taken the money without asking it, was the realization that this was part of a larger pattern of behavior I had been enabling for years. I had always been the responsible one in the family, the one who worked tirelessly, never asking for help, and always making sure that everything ran smoothly. But now I could see that my endless sacrifices had only contributed to the dysfunction that had taken root in our family. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the events of the day over and over. How could they do this to me? I had worked so hard for everything I had achieved. This loan was supposed to be my last hurdle before graduating and becoming a registered nurse. Without it, I couldn't afford my clinical rotations, and without those, I couldn't graduate. My dream of becoming a nurse was slipping away because of a selfish, thoughtless decision made by the people I loved most. Grandma Helen was the only person I could talk to. She had been a constant source of support throughout my life, and I knew she would understand. I called her late that night, my voice shaky as I tried to explain what had happened. I could hear the concern in her voice as I spoke, and she didn't hesitate for a second. "Don't worry, Emily," she said, her tone firm yet soothing. "We'll figure this out." I felt a wave of relief wash over me as her words settled in. Grandma Helen had always been the steady hand, the one who never panicked, no matter how bad things got. She had seen hardship in her own life and knew how to handle adversity. It was time for me to take a lesson from her to face this head-on and finally stand up for myself. The next morning, Grandma and I sat down at the kitchen table, a cup of hot coffee between us, the steam swirling in the cold air. I had expected to feel overwhelmed by everything, but instead, a strange sense of calm had settled in. I knew that with Grandma by my side, I wasn't alone in this. "We need to come up with a plan," Emily Grandma said, her sharp eyes meeting mine. "And we need to do it quickly." I nodded. But how they took all of it. Every penny. How am I supposed to finish school now? Grandma took a deep breath and placed her hands on the table, her fingers tracing the edges of the wood. "First, we have to gather the facts. We'll go through everything, the loan, the note, and anything else we can find that shows what they did. Once we have everything in order, we can start figuring out how to fix this." I was still in shock. It seemed like too much to handle, but as Grandma talked, her words began to ground me. She was right, this wasn't just about the money. This was about boundaries, about standing up for myself, and about holding my family accountable for their actions. The first step was to call the bank and see if there was any way to stop the transfer that had been made from my account. Unfortunately, the money had already been sent to the travel agency, and it was too late to reverse the transaction. I felt a pang of disappointment in my chest. There was no turning back. Next, Grandma suggested we reach out to the school's financial aid office to explain the situation. I called them the following morning, but of course the office was closed for the holidays. I left a message, hoping that someone would get back to me soon. But as the hours passed, I began to realize that I might not get the help I needed in time. The weight of everything began to feel suffocating, and I found myself pacing back and forth in the living room, unable to sit still. Grandma, who had been quietly observing, stood up from the table and placed her hand gently on my shoulder. "Emily, this isn't just about money. This is about what your family has done to you over the years. It's time to put an end to it." Her words struck me hard. She was right. My family had taken advantage of me for years, borrowing money using my credit cards, damaging my possessions, and never once asking for permission. I had always forgiven them, always made excuses because they were family. But now I realized that I had been enabling their behavior, allowing them to continue making irresponsible decisions without consequences. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't keep letting them do this to me. I had to take control of my own life, even if it meant standing up to the people I loved most. "We need to make them understand," I said, my voice shaking with determination. "We need to make them take responsibility for what they've done." Grandma nodded, her expression serious. "And we will, but it's going to take strength and it's going to take courage. Are you ready for that?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes, I am." Grandma smiled faintly, as if she had been waiting for me to say those words. "Good. Now here's what we're going to do. We're going to put together a repayment plan. You will present it to your family, and you will make it clear that they will be held accountable for what they've done. No more excuses, no more delays. This time, they're going to have to face the consequences." The plan was simple, but firm. Grandma helped me put together a repayment agreement detailing the $10,000 that had been taken from my account. We included a clear schedule of payments outlining when and how the money would be returned. The agreement also included a clause that stipulated that if the money wasn't repaid within a reasonable time frame, I would take legal action. I was nervous as we worked through the details. It felt surreal to be planning a confrontation with my own family, but I knew it was necessary. They had crossed a line, and I had to make sure they understood that there were consequences for their actions. Over the next couple of days, Grandma and I gathered all the documentation we could find, the bank statements showing the withdrawal of the money, the note left by my parents, and the photos of the cruise that had been posted on social media. We had all the evidence we needed to prove that my family had taken the money without my consent. When everything was ready, I called my family. I was trembling with anxiety, but I knew this was the moment I had to face them. The phone rang several times before my mother answered. "Hello?" she said, sounding surprised. "Mom, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "About the money you took from my account." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could hear the faint sound of my mother's breath. Finally, she spoke. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice defensive. "We didn't take anything. It was a family account." I felt my anger rise. "Mom, you used my student loan money for a vacation. I need that money to finish school. How could you do this to me?" The line went silent again, and I knew I had caught her off guard. My mother had always been able to deflect responsibility, but this time I wasn't backing down. "We'll be home soon," she said finally, "and we can talk about it then." "I don't want to talk about it when you get home," I said firmly. "I want you to understand that this is serious. I've put together a repayment plan, and you're going to have to sign it." There was another pause, and then I heard my father's voice in the background, muffled but unmistakable. "Give me that phone," he said, and the line clicked as my father took over the conversation. "We're not signing anything," he said, his tone sharp. "This is ridiculous. You're making a big deal out of nothing." I took a deep breath. "No, Dad. This isn't nothing. You took my money without permission. You're going to make this right, or there will be consequences." The conversation ended shortly after that. I didn't know what to expect when they came home, but I was ready to face them. With Grandma by my side, I was prepared to stand my ground, and make them take responsibility for what they had done. In this part of the story, Emily begins to take control of the situation, preparing to confront her family and demand accountability for their actions. With the help of Grandma Helen, she creates a repayment plan, gathers the necessary evidence, and prepares for a difficult confrontation. The tension builds as Emily realizes that standing up to her family is the only way to break the cycle of financial irresponsibility and assert her own boundaries. The day my family was due to return from their cruise, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into the unknown. I had no idea what to expect. Would they understand the gravity of what they had done? Or would they dismiss it like they always had in the past and try to brush everything under the rug? The thought of confronting them, of holding them accountable, was terrifying. But deep down, I knew this was my only chance to change the pattern, to finally assert control over my life and make them realize that their actions had real consequences. Grandma Helen, as always, stood beside me, calm and resolute. The day had been spent preparing for the confrontation. We had double-checked the repayment agreement, reviewed the evidence, and made sure everything was in place. I had called in a few favors from Grandma's friends, Terry, the retired lawyer, and Martin, the locksmith, who would be there to back us up if needed. They had all agreed to support me in this, and knowing that gave me a small sense of comfort. Grandma was determined to help me take a stand, and I knew she was right. This wasn't just about money. It was about setting boundaries, about making my family understand that I wasn't a doormat anymore. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as the hours crawled by. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but every time I glanced at the door, my heart would race. I had no idea how they would react. Would they be angry? Would they try to guilt-trip me into forgiving them? Would they apologize and beg me to forget about it? Around 4 p.m., I got the notification on my phone. Their flight had landed. They were on their way home. My heart thudded in my chest and my palms began to sweat. I knew that the next few hours would determine everything. It wasn't just about money. It was about my future, about standing up for myself, about making sure I never let them take advantage of me again. Grandma, I said, my voice trembling slightly. What if they don't take this seriously? What if they just brush it off like they always do? Grandma gave me a small, reassuring smile. You're doing the right thing, Emily. You've got to trust yourself. And remember, we have the support we need. They can't just walk all over you anymore. I nodded, trying to steady my nerves. Grandma's calmness was a steadying force, but I could still feel the tight knot of anxiety in my stomach. It was hard to imagine that this was really happening, that I was about to confront the people I love most in the world about something so deep and hurtful. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. I froze for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. They were here. I looked at Grandma, who gave me a firm nod. It's time, Emily. We walked to the door together, and I opened it to see my family standing there. They looked exactly as I had imagined, sunburned, laden with souvenirs, smiling, and full of the carefree energy that had been absent from my home for so long. They had no idea what was waiting for them. What's going on? My father asked, his voice annoyed as he reached for the doorknob, trying to come in. Why is the door locked? I changed the locks. I said, my voice steady but firm. We need to talk first. There was a brief moment of confusion on their faces, and then my mom's expression shifted to one of annoyance. Emily opened the door. We've been traveling all day. It's freezing out here. I'll open the door when we've talked, I said. Looking at them all, making sure they understood that I wasn't backing down. I need you to listen to me, all of you. My father's face turned red. This is ridiculous. We're family, Emily. Open the door now. No, I replied calmly. We are going to have a conversation before you come inside. You're going to listen to me, and you're going to take responsibility for what you've done. There was a long pause as they all looked at each other, trying to figure out how to respond. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice tinged with guilt. Emily, we're sorry. It wasn't meant to hurt you. We just saw a last-minute deal on the cruise, and we thought it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I shook my head. It wasn't just a last-minute deal. You used my $10,000 loan without asking, without even telling me. This money was for my education, for my future. I needed that money to finish my clinical rotations and graduate. And you didn't even think to ask me. My father scoffed, his arms folded across his chest. Oh, please, it's just money. You're being way too dramatic about this. I felt my anger rise, but I kept my voice steady. No, Dad, it's not just money. It's my future. It's my education. And you've stolen it from me. This is not just about finances. This is about respect, about boundaries. You cannot just take whatever you want from me because you think I'll always forgive you." My mom's face fell, and for the first time I saw a flicker of shame in her eyes. "We didn't think about it that way," she said softly. "We were just so excited." "I'm sorry, Emily. I truly am. But I couldn't let them off the hook that easily. Sorry isn't enough this time. I've spent my whole life cleaning up your messes, forgiving you, making excuses for you. But that ends now." Grandma Helen stepped forward, her small but firm presence beside me. "What Emily is saying is the truth. You've taken advantage of her kindness for too long. You've put her in this position where she has to be the responsible one while you continue to make reckless decisions." The realization seemed to hit my father at that moment. He looked at me, then at Grandma, and then down at the ground. For the first time I saw a crack in his usual arrogance. "We never meant to hurt you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice softer than usual. "We were just overwhelmed. I didn't think about the consequences." "Well, now you will," I said, my voice resolute. "I've put together a repayment plan, and I expect you to honor it. You will pay back every penny you took from me. If you don't, I will have no choice but to take legal action." There was a long silence, and I could see the tension building in the room. My mother opened her mouth to argue, but Grandma held up a hand silencing her. "No more excuses. This is the consequence of your actions." My brother Chris, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke up. "Look, I know we've all screwed up, but Emily's right. We need to make this right. You don't just take someone's money and not pay it back." My sister Lily nodded. "I'm sorry, Emily. We should have thought of you first." Hearing them apologize, hearing them finally recognize the harm they had caused, was a small but significant moment. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. I wasn't sure how long it would take for my family to truly change, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I had stood up for myself. "Thank you," I said quietly, looking at each of them. "This is just the beginning, but we'll move forward together on the right terms." After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, my parents agreed to sign the repayment plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The next few weeks were filled with tense conversations, financial tracking, and a slow rebuilding of trust. My parents struggled at first, but eventually they stuck to the agreement, paying back part of the money and committing to making changes. As for me, I finally felt like I could breathe. The financial burden had been lifted, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. My future was no longer a hostage to my family's mistakes, and that was something I could finally be proud of. In this final part of the story, Emily confronts her family and demands accountability for the money they took from her. The confrontation is tense and difficult, but through Grandma Helen's support and her own resolve, Emily is able to assert her boundaries and take control of her future. While the journey is far from over, Emily's courage and the changes that follow mark a turning point in her relationship with her family, as well as in her own personal growth. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.